Welcome. I'm so glad you could all join us this evening for a wonderful talk co-hosted by the Department of Sociology and the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. I'm Linda Harling-Stalker. I have two hats here today I'm so thrilled to be wearing, both as the director of the Mulroney Institute and a professor in sociology. Today we meet in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. As we will be hearing about new technology this evening, let us always remember the 7 grandfather teachings: honesty, humility, truth, courage, respect, wisdom, and love. Today, I am honored to introduce our speaker, David Elliott. David is currently a Trudeau Fellow and PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa, where he researches the social and political effects of artificial intelligence. He is a member of the Center for Tech Law and Society, as well as the Critical Surveillance and Security Lab, where his work on AI has been recognized with numerous awards. Tonight, we celebrate his new book, Artificially Intelligent, which places humans at the center of AI's story, making a compelling case for the role we have yet to play in technology's transformation of our world. The books are available at the back for the low, low price. And if you're an academic book buyer, you know this is a low, low price of $34.60. Is that what it came to with tax? So for a hardcover book from an academic press, it is a steal. What's that? Had to fight them. Fight them for that. Oh. So that's the official part of the introduction. For those that don't know, David graduated from StFX with an honors degree in sociology back in 2020, where I believe we pilfered him from business at one point. I could say he saw the light, but we won't say that. David is one of those students who you knew was going to be a superstar no matter what he did. And I'm not just saying that because he is on record saying one of the courses he took with me was his favorite during his time at StFX. David started interrogating issues surrounding AI and its future long before it was in the mainstream. His honors thesis, supervised by Dr. Rod Banshees, was titled The Schwarzenegger Conundrum: What Happens When AI and Politics Meet? With this thesis that David was doing here at StFX, he was already establishing himself as an undergraduate student, as a foremost authority on AI, society, and politics writ large. Now, without having yet defended his PhD, David has a book out from one of the largest university presses in Canada, virtually unheard of. To say we are proud of David would be an understatement. What he has achieved is truly awe-inspiring. I also want to say I'm a bit proud of StFX and the sociology department for recognizing his immense talent and intelligence, and to offer the foundations, the tools, and latitude for him to continue to rise. It has been such a pleasure to be a small part of his success. Okay, enough of the Hallmark sentiment before we start crying and get all emotional about it. Please join me in welcoming David Elliott to the stage.
Well, thank you so much. And as Dr. Harling-Stalker said, I am a StFX grad, as I'm sure many of you noted from the obnoxious bling that I've only realized is obnoxious since I moved out of Nova Scotia. But tonight is very exciting for me because I've been on this book tour for about a month and a half now. And in most of the rooms I sit in, it's all strangers. It's all faces I don't know. But tonight there's a lot of people who I do know. And that makes me so happy because it's not just people that I know, but it's people who I wouldn't be here without. So I want to take a quick second to thank a couple people. Of course, I need to thank Dr. Rod Banshees, who dragged me out by the heels of my feet out of business school, sat me down one day and said, if you leave business school, or if you stay in business school, you're going to make a lot of money, kid. But if you come to sociology, you're going to make no money, but maybe you'll be happy. And Rod could not have been more right. I'm grateful every day that he gave me that talk and dragged me out. I also need to thank the entire sociology department. If you actually open up the book, you will see in my acknowledgements, there are only 5 people who are acknowledged. Well, 5 acknowledgements, and one of them is to the entire sociology department at StFX. And speaking to all of you and any young professors who are here, any future professors who are here, before I get to the formal part of tonight, I've now had the opportunity to travel around the world to many different universities, both as a visiting scholar, as a permanent scholar, and in many different capacities. And StFX has something truly special here. One of the things I found when I left StFX that was different from most places is, especially at the first university I went to after, I won't name names, but there was an attitude of sit down and wait your time. An attitude of looking at young scholars who had potential or opportunity, even the undergrads that I taught as a TA, and you would go and you'd say, this kid has something. You know, we should foster, we should like promote them to do more. Students would say, no, they're just an undergrad. Tell them to sit down and wait their time. That was never a feeling I got when I was at StFX. I only got the feeling of when I would come to professors and propose something truly stupid. I never felt anything but support. And I was telling Rod today about I have a memory of being in the annex. And it's a moment I write about in the book of discovering AI for the first time, seeing this program that said it could write like a human. So it was 2019, before we knew what ChatGPT was. And I got to see GPT-2, and I was mesmerized by it. And I walked into his office. Keep in mind, he'd already funded me for a grant for the summer to do work on Canadian politics. We'd already started working on my thesis at this point. And I say, Rod, there's this thing called AI. It can write like a human. This is what I want. I want to drop everything and work on this. And he said, sounds worthwhile. We should write a paper. No, wait your time. No, you're just an undergrad kid. We should write a paper. That is the way that young scholars should be treated. And that's the way you can be treated at institutions like StFX. So I thank everybody from the sociology department, because I truly would not be sitting where I am without all of you guys and the respect that you showed me, which I know is not just the respect you showed me, it's the respect you showed every student. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for that. But on to the formal part tonight. So what are we going to be doing? So as Dr. Harling-Stalker said, I've got this book out, and we're going to talk a bit about the book. But I'm not going to really tell you what's in the book, because if I told you what's in the book, you wouldn't buy it for $34.99. But also, I think if you wanted to know exactly what was in it, you wouldn't come here. You'd read it. And if you wanted to listen to me talk about the book, you'd buy the audiobook. So what I'm going to try and do tonight is talk about a couple of things that aren't in the book. A couple of things for those of you who might get to the chance to read it, that will give you more value from it. And for those of you who will never read it, that might give you something to chew on. It might give you something to think about. So you leave here with a bit of thought about AI and some new perspective on it. But before we do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a bit from the book. I am going to read a bit from the first chapter, because I think it's important to speak to why I wrote this book and what type of book this is. The first chapter, I think, really encapsulates that. After we do that, I'm going to try and hit on 3 points. But you know what? I'll tell you about those 3 points after we get through the first chapter here. So the first chapter, which name does not make sense to what we are about to read, is the household name that no one knows. Before I was an academic, I was a magician. Not the top hat wearing rabbit out of a hat type of magician, though. There were no boxes and no dancing ladies. All the audience saw on stage was me, a small table, and a deck of cards. I had one job every night. Do the impossible, and don't get caught cheating. The thankless thing about doing magic is that, when done right, your audience will never know how hard you had to work to pull it off. In reality, the audience only ever sees about 15% of the show. The other 85% is hidden from them. But ask any magician, and they will tell you that the hidden 85% is where the real magic happens. The hidden moves that we spend lifetimes prospecting, the vital pieces of information we withhold from the audience to create the illusion of the impossible. You could probably go your whole life without encountering the underworld of magic. Networks of private clubs, companies, and conventions. A community of people dedicated to building and sharing secrets. Meetings between magicians are fascinating because we all have stories about tricks gone wrong or new sleight of hand discoveries. but we can't tell anybody else about them. It's not because of some secret or solemn oath, but because once you know how the trick works, the illusion is shattered and we lose our power. Magic shows are at their best when the audience is oblivious to how the tricks are done. If I fool you with a trick, you might think about it for the rest of your life. But if you go home and find out how it works on YouTube, you might never think about it again. It is the mystery that gives us power. AI is a lot like magic. The first time you see a good AI system, it really does feel like magic. Yet it goes deeper than that. AI has power over us because we don't understand what's going on behind the curtain. But pull back the curtain, reveal what's going on behind the scenes, and it's actually quite mundane, quite understandable. Pull back the curtain, and it loses its power. Unlike magic, I don't think the secrets of AI should be gatekept. They belong to everybody, or they belong to everyone, and everybody has the right to understand how AI works. I wanted to read you that intro because I think it captures why I wrote this book and who it's for. I wrote this book because I come from the academy. I am an academic. But I found more and more that my friends, who've had the same barroom conversations you've all probably had, were getting more and more terrified of AI. And my friends come from all sorts of different places. Some of them are woodworkers, some of them are plumbers, some of them are marketing executives, and unfortunately, a couple of them are politicians. But they all want to understand AI. And when they would ask me for a book to help them understand it, I would give them books. There's lots of books I love. Stuart Russell's Human Compatible, which was first given to me by Dr. Banshees, my favorite book on the topic. But then months would pass and I'd revisit it, and I'd realize they never read it. Or they would say, I cracked it open, I started, but it wasn't for me. And I realized that this conversation, they were having a hard time joining it because we weren't speaking to them. We were giving them these dry technical manuals or these nonfiction academic books that for the regular person were inaccessible. For the regular person who, when they come home from their 9 to 5, by the time they finish cooking their dinner and putting their kids to bed, they're having to choose between reading that book or watching Disney Plus. And quite honestly, Disney Plus is way better than most of those books I spend my life reading. So my goal was to write something for these people, to write something which had academic rigor, but gave them the introduction so they could join this conversation. And we're going to be talking at the end of this talk about why I think that is so important and why, especially on the topic of AI, it is so important that we give these people the language to join the conversation. So we're going to talk about 3 things today. The first thing we're going to talk about is what AI is. And as I said, I want to talk about stuff that isn't in the book. And you might be thinking, David, you must have defined AI in this book. Reality is I did. But the definition of AI in this book is not my real definition. I cheated because it was easier. It was easier for the people I was writing for. Because it's much like in chemistry class, when they first teach you about how the atom is constructed with the electrons. I think it's the Higgs model. I always forget that one. I failed chemistry. That's why I'm a sociologist. It works. But then you get to grade 12 chemistry or first year university, and they tell you that's not actually how the atom works. We just told you that because it was simple for what you needed to know. That's the answer I give in the book. Today, we've got lots of academics here, lots of interested young people. We're going to go more in depth. We're going to talk more in depth about my definition of what AI actually is, because it's much harder to define than you might think. The second thing we're going to talk about is why we use history to talk about AI. It's something that seems to lend itself more to futuristic and sci-fi. And there's lots of great sci-fi discussing it, but this at its core is a history book. Why do we use history? Particularly, why should we look at the steam engine? And I'm not going to talk about jobs in the steam engine because I beat that to death in the media, and you can read all about that. I'm going to talk about something much sexier. Infrastructure. You can tell we have a lot of academics in the room because that's usually a laugh line. And so many of you leaned in and were like, tell me more. But we're going to talk about AI as infrastructure and the history of infrastructure and the importance infrastructure has for defining our societies. And once we're finished talking about that, we're going to talk about why all this matters. and what each of us can do. Why it's so important to join this conversation, because we're at the Mulroney Center, we're going to talk about policy, the importance of AI policy, and how we get to good, meaningful AI policy that helps us construct a society for everybody instead of just a society for the few. So first question, what is AI? It's a really interesting topic because I am currently writing my PhD thesis, as Dr. Harling-Stalker pointed out, and I decided to start it with this question of what is AI? And to get there, I was like, you know what? I'm going to look at all the top legislation there is on this. Let's look at the European Union legislation. Let's look at the Canadian legislation, all the American stuff. Let's look at the definition from the technical experts. It's a mess. They will give a definition and they'll have a nice clean definition, and then they will publish a 500-page book explaining why their definition is wrong. And being like, okay, well, here's something, a technology we think should be in the definition of AI, but doesn't fit in that definition. Here's 50 technologies that fit in that definition that we don't actually want to regulate. And it feels like smoke. It feels like the regulators are grasping at smoke, trying to decide, what is this thing? What is this thing that we can all feel? We all know it's here. If AI didn't exist in some extent, why would every university be funding 100 new positions for AI? Why would we be putting together these think tanks? Why would we be passing this regulation? There's something tangible that we can feel that has happened that is new. But it's also interesting because AI isn't new. My mother was an AI researcher in the 80s. She worked at Queen's University working on AI. It's not new, but it feels new. So I decided to go back in history to try and figure this out. And my favorite examples have actually come from going back to the person many claim is the beginning of the study of AI, Alan Turing. So in 1953, Alan Turing publishes his famous paper in the journal Mind. And it's the paper that first really proposes that intelligent machines are possible. And this paper, much like Turing, suffers from a number of tragedies. The first tragedy being the tragedy of Turing's life, that he died not too long after he published this paper under very tragic circumstances because of prosecution of his own government because he was a homosexual. But also because of that, and amplified by the fact that Turing has not been around to defend his paper, like most great pieces of philosophy, it is greatly misunderstood. Because he proposed ideas that were simple to understand and simple to repeat. But most people who teach Turing's work have never read his paper. And most people who have read the paper have never read the complete body of his work. I'm ashamed to admit it wasn't until this year that I read his work in its entirety. And when you read the work in its entirety, you realize that what we think we understand about Turing, the popular conception of Turing and his idea of AI, is wrong. It's not what he was saying. And what he was saying is actually, I think, the best way to come to understand what AI is. So in the popular conception, Turing talks about the Turing test. We think of the Turing test as a way to decide what AI or what machines are intelligent and what ones aren't. And we think of it as a test for the machine. The test has an interrogator. The interrogator is a human, a wall. We have a blind interrogator. Then we have a machine and a human. The interrogator asks questions. The machine and the human answer. And the interrogator's job is to decide which one is human and which one is a machine. And the machine is intelligent if it can render the interrogator useless. That's the normal way we talk about it. That's what we call a behavioralist definition of AI, that the machine is intelligent if it behaves in a way that the human cannot distinguish a difference. But when you read the paper, you realize he's not testing the machine. He never talks about a behavioralist perspective. He's testing the interrogator. All of Turing's work is testing the interrogator and asking, is this interrogator likely to imagine a conception of intelligence? And reading the complete body of his work, you find his obsession with understanding interrogators from different technical backgrounds, playing different games, not just the game we are talking about now, but a game of chess, and how interrogators playing a machine that plays chess with different knowledges of chess might imagine intelligence at different levels. And what we come to understand from reading more of his work is that what he was getting at here is not the machine is the thing that holds intelligence. The intelligence is a sociological concept. It is a social concept, an emotional concept produced by the interrogator, that the interrogator is imagining intelligence upon this being. But the question comes from that we might get lost in subjectivity. if it's just the interrogator making the decision, is this thing intelligent? Then it just becomes subjective to the interrogator, which is the problem because Turing is very clear in all of his work that he already thinks machines are intelligent, which means that to Turing, machines are intelligent. Do we just accept then that machines can be intelligent and are intelligent? Well, no, because Turing also thought that intelligence was a social concept. In fact, Turing spent a lot of time at Cambridge attending the lectures, and I don't usually include this in this talk, but we got academics here. A lot of time attending the talks of Ludwig Wittgenstein. When we go into Turing's journals, he was at every talk Wittgenstein gave during that time. And once you know that, you see Wittgenstein everywhere in his work. And you start to realize that Turing started understanding AI and the concept of intelligence as a social construct. And when he was talking about intelligent machines, he was talking about a shift, about an idea of the shift of the human language, of us starting to accept machines as being intelligent and say that they have passed some sort of point where now the social shifts. And I like to draw a comparison here for those of you who don't know Wittgenstein to Jane Goodall, who we lost recently. And in one of her memorials, they talked about how before Jane Goodall, we didn't see apes as intelligent, which is a weird thing to think about now, right? That like we see primates as intelligent, we call our cats intelligent, we call animals intelligent. That was not the norm. Then Jane Goodall went, did her experiments, we started to see these behaviors of these creatures, and society shifted, academia shifted. We started talking about, oh, apes have these innate characteristics that make them intelligent. They're behaving in intelligent ways, and the language changed. We started speaking about intelligence. We started to see how intelligence is something that is imagined onto this. The final thing I'll say on this point, which I find really interesting, is that in the final lines of Turing's paper in Mind, he makes a quote, which is shockingly misquoted, which I have written in papers misquoted, about how in 50 years' time, a machine will be able to pass a Turing test and be intelligent. And it's read as a prediction that in 50 years' time, from the time he wrote that paper, we will be able to make machines that will pass the Turing test, and therefore that machine will be intelligent. But I implore you, go back and read the paper, because it's not what he says. He says, and I'm going to misquote this slightly again, but he says, in 50 years' time, there will be machines that can pass the Turing test, and society will have accepted machines as being intelligent. What he's saying is that by the time that we have machines that can pass the Turing test, machines will progress to a point in which society will have changed our language to accept machines as intelligent. Machines will have already gained the attributes that we need as a society, as a social group, to project intelligence on them. And it's such a testament to Alan Turing's brilliance that not 50 years, about 65 to 70 years later, but we can forgive him for that, ChatGPT emerges, a system which can pass the Turing test and becomes the catalyst, even though ChatGPT is not the first AI system. It's 12 years later. It becomes the catalyst for the moment that humans start having the conversation meaningfully about can machines be intelligent. It becomes the catalyst for a shift in our language, which accepts that machines can act in intelligent ways. So with that, what is my definition of AI? Well, the thing we are experiencing is not an individual technology. It's not like a toaster. We can't point to a toaster. We can't, point to AI and say, this is AI, like we point to a toaster. AI is a collection of technologies, is a collection of processes, socio-technical, that come together to create a subset of technologies that we as humans have begun accepting as behaving in intelligent ways. Not everybody has, and that is okay, because this is a conversation about how we want to treat the language, which is why I have professors that don't accept AI as existing. I have professors that do. This is the discourse that we are having right now. But it becomes interesting in that case, because when I talk about AI, of what makes this moment different, I think about deep learning as being the core principle here. It's a core principle you see in most of the regulation I work with too. And deep learning, for those who don't know, is the technology that makes most of the things you call AI now, be it ChatGPT or predictive AI, possible. It's a specific training mechanism. And some people like to say, well, then deep learning is AI, but I say no. It's as if we look at a car and call AI a car. You have different types of car. You have Ferraris, you have Honda Civics. One thing they might all have in common is they have an engine. I would call deep learning right now the engine. It is the combustion engine. But to point at that engine and say that is AI, or to point at that engine and say that is a car, would be crazy. It's not a car, it's an engine. But take the engine out of the car and it really does kind of cease to be a car. It doesn't work like a car. So it is this important piece right now. But just like we can replace that engine with an electric engine, there are new technologies that we could invent that add that ability, that inherent ability that makes a machine act in the ways that seem to be producing our societal reaction of this is intelligent. So a lot of the research of AI tends to circle around deep learning in that sense. So that's a bit of my definition of what AI is. And it really comes from these developments of deep learning that really came to a head in 2012 with AlexNet. That gives us our second fact here, our second chapter, one might say. And the second chapter is, the infrastructure. It's this question of why do we use history? And I think we should use history to look at AI, because one of the interesting things is the more you research AI, the more you realize that the problems we are having are not new. They've all been repeated before. So one of the things that makes AI so disruptive in society today is the fact that AI is a general purpose technology. And for those of you who don't know what a general purpose technology is, it's a technology unlike a toaster, which really only revolutionized the bread making and breakfast world. AI cuts across everything. It cuts across every industry, whether you're working in a factory, whether you're working in a blue collar job, a white collar job, in a hospital, in a university. AI is everywhere. That's the power general purpose technologies have. The best two parallels we can draw are the internet and the steam engine. I think they're important parallels. Because when we look at the internet changed everything in society. But I think we have relatively managed it. It's had its problems. Some of the scholars in this room will argue with me on that, and it's a point that deserves to be argued against, because society's managing of the internet has been difficult. We've seen massive offshoring of labor. We've seen problems with disinformation, political campaigns. We've also seen good of it from every terrible campaign as Trump, who came from the internet. You have the Arab Spring, and there's lots of questions. The legacy of the internet will be left to future historians. But I think as a society, we've overwhelmingly managed the first 50 years, 30 years of the World Wide Web, I think. We've managed the first transition half decently well. The same cannot be said with the steam engine. The steam engine was a technology that when it came in, brought about the Industrial Revolution alongside other social factors. But it is the driving technological force of the Industrial Revolution. And although we may now think of the Industrial Revolution as a good thing, I mean, it brought us the beer that they're serving at the townhouse. It brought us these tables. It brought us our idea of what a classroom looks like. The Industrial Revolution cannot be decoupled from the 100 years of pain and suffering that followed it. From artisans, from farmers being pulled from their communities and their land and forced into cities like London and New York, being forced to work on assembly lines for mere pennies, 16 to 17 hours a day next to children, for nothing but the right to have a meager living with no dignity to it. That is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. That 100 years of power being accumulated in specific groups who controlled that machinery, who influenced their physical and political power over those under them. So my question of AI always has to come back to, is AI the internet or is it the Industrial Revolution? And how do we prepare for both of those scenarios? So the thing that makes it interesting is that AI and general purpose technologies are not products. Although we tend to see them right now as products, we see ChatGPT, we see these systems, that is the window dressing. AI is infrastructure. When we see general purpose technologies enter society, they tend to enter through three phases: reinvention, reimagination, and recombination. You can tell that theory came from a business school because they all start with the same letter. Reinvention is the first phase. Reinvention is kind of, in a sense, the phase that has the most hype. It's when we talk about the AI hype. And that's the moment when you create this new general purpose technology and has all these features and you say, hey, we've already got this place. We can plug this right in. With the Industrial Revolution, let's think about the water wheel. You had the factories. There were already textile factories using a water wheel. And somebody said, hey, let's stick the steam engine on it, turn the water wheel. This is amazing. You have the ox pulling the cart. Let's stick a steam engine on it. This is amazing. Massive moment, but not the really exciting one. It's a moment where, you're making some processes better. You're going through de-skilling. It's a scary moment for society. And it's where the conversation tends to be about work. But reimagination, that's where we really get interesting. Reimagination is about the building of infrastructure. And it's about the ability to look at the technology and say, hey, this has different inherent features than the thing we had before. What can we do with those different inherent features? If you look at the factories as they were built before the steam engine, they were built with a single point for an engine to sit upon, because that is the way they could harness nature. After the steam engine, they started building assembly lines. They started building new imaginations of what a factory could look like, about how human labor could be divided based upon the new abilities brought about by the steam engine. With AI, we are going through that exact same moment right now. It has already begun. A moment of reimagining the base level of our society, the economic base, through AI technology, about how we embed it into new systems in new ways. It is not about the products. It is about the embedding of infrastructure, and more importantly, who controls that infrastructure. I'd like to also draw attention to the railroad. So railroad is the best way for us to understand how this infrastructure shapes our nations and shapes the way we live. When we built the Trans-Canada Railway, even just the building of it defined our immigration processes. But then where we built it defined what cities or what towns became cities and what towns died. It defined what types of businesses were built, and the governance of that infrastructure defined our nation, defined our governments. Governments rose and fell based on the governance of the railway. So we begin to see how infrastructure affects the way our society builds itself out economically and socially. We're already seeing this in the way that smart glasses are being built. Smart glasses are an AI product, but they're not AI as a product. They're AI as computing. They're a new vision of computing, the same way that we moved from mainframe computing to desktop computing with the invention of the Intel 404 chip. We are seeing a new transition of, we don't know where we're going with it, but a new transition of an idea that there needs to be a new form of computing. A new form, same of, we went from mainframe, desktop to cellular. Each of those was inspired by a different technical revolution, a different opening of new doors that needed a new framework, a new infrastructure for how we interact with computing. AI has introduced a similar challenge, and Silicon Valley is rising to it with new ideas of what computing in the AI age looks like with AI infrastructure. That's also why people like to laugh at these companies investing so much money in their data centers, their AI, all this stuff. People laugh at Google all the time. They look at Google and they say, you missed the boat. Gemini sucks. It's the worst of all the major chatbots. How did they miss the boat on AI? I guarantee you, if you sit in a Google boardroom right now and you say that, they laugh you out. Google didn't fall behind. Google built infrastructure. 80% of AI unicorn companies are hosted on Google servers. 80% are hosted on Google infrastructure. They also invested heavily in medical AI, in hospitals, and building the infrastructure that other companies need to build themselves on top of. But that brings us to chapter 3. What do we do about all this? Because there's a very interesting thing here. The interesting thing is people say, oh, well, I think we need to rewrite the rules then. It seems like we're heading to this new society. The rules are already being rewritten. I was invited to a private conference about 2 years ago that was a who's who of economic conspiracy theories. You had the World Bank, you had the IMF, the US Economic Bureau, and then me, the PhD, student at the time from U Ottawa. And at the beginning, I'm like, I'm not going to talk at all. They didn't even mean to send me this invitation. And then slowly throughout the week, I started realizing, oh my goodness, these guys, they don't seem to know what they're talking about. And then I started asking about it. They're like, oh, none of us know what's going on. We're just being tapped in to, come up with these series and write these rules because we need to go somewhere and we need to start from somewhere. But we're all starting on the same page because the rules have been rewritten. We don't know anything. But the same old dogs were brought in to figure out where we go from here. You realize that the rules are being rewritten, that we are starting to build new rules for how we build this infrastructure and how we govern it like we did with the steam engine. So I'd like to start this section with a quote from another Dr. Harling-Stalker class, and not the one I said was my favorite. The quote by H.G. Wells, one of the first sociologists, and also the man who wrote War of the Worlds, that the purpose of sociology should be to build utopias and then to critique them and ask ourselves how we get slightly closer to them. And I think that's a quote that speaks to policy as well, what the goal of policy should be. The goal of policy should ask ourselves, where do we want to be and how do we get closer to that? Because right now, as AI rewrites the rules of our society, we are rewriting new policy. And the difficulty I have with this is that the people that we are inviting into these conversations about creating the rules of this new world, they tend to be people like me. They tend to be technologists. And I get in a lot of fights with, I just put out an article about this in Maclean's. On the same day that they announced the new Canadian AI Advisory Board, and a lot of that board was my friends. And that article was very mean to people who are on advisory boards. And I had to say to them, I'm like, I love you, but I stand by what I said. Because if you look at each and every one of you, you're all either a tech CEO, you might be a privacy expert, you might be an AI ethicist, you come from a tech background. Reality is AI is a general purpose technology. It affects all of us. The only person who knows how AI is going to affect the university are the people who work in it. The only people who understand how AI is going to affect their community are the people from that community. When we look at the world we want to build, the world we're moving into, it needs to be a conversation that comes from all of us. A conversation about building the values that we desire to see with AI. What type of AI future we want for everybody. Because to me, policy should be about bumpers. It should be about setting up an ideal of where we should be, not speaking down and saying, no, you don't build that, but saying, here is where we should be, and here's how we get there. Here is just lines to work in. And I always think about, I had my first talk, I had a libertarian in the front row, and my last talk in Toronto, I had an anthropic engineer come in and be like, you just want to kill AI, you just want to regulate it, you're going to tell us what we can and can't do, that's terrible. I say no. They say, engineers just want to build. So you haven't been to Silicon Valley recently. So when I go down to Silicon Valley and I talk to those engineers, they want regulation. And they want regulation because a lot of those engineers got into this, yes, just to build. But you know what they ended up building? They built systems that pushed young women to eating disorders. That's the Facebook engineers. They've all had to live with that. The top students that come out of Canadian technical universities and American technical universities, Stanford, Waterloo, they don't go into medicine. They don't go into the fields that we see as providing massive value for society. They go into finance. They go into surveillance technology. They go into surveillance advertising technology. And in Canada, more than anything, the number one hire in Canada of these graduates from Waterloo, porn companies. This is what our best engineers are being pushed into. And a lot of them have realized the market is already defining the types of systems that they are building. The job of policy is to, at the beginning, imagine the values that we want this to be built within and provide guardrails for how we get there. Not to dictate what these engineers build, but to give them a pathway to work upon. Not to constrain and say you must build this, but to give a pathway and bumpers that they can move between. That is what good policy should look to do. But as I say, that policy can only come, we can only build an idealized vision, because utopias, and even as H.G. Wells would say, any utopia is actually a dystopia. Because utopias come from one person or one group of people. So our goal should be to build a vision of what we want AI's future in Canada, AI's future in the US, AI's future in our generations to look like. And that vision can't come from the top down. It can't come from the technologists. We need farmers in the room. We need agro workers in the room. We need marketing executives in the room. Yes, we need politicians in the room, unfortunately. We need everybody to join, but the problem is the reason we hand it over to the technologists is because we don't understand, because the curtain's been pulled, and it's so easy to offer it up. It's so easy to say, I don't understand that. So I wrote this book as my political action. My political action, instead of taking my time for my PhD, producing articles that would have got me hopefully a tenure track job, to say my action is to take the first step, because the first step needs to come from technologists, to make a concerted effort to pull back the curtain. The second step needs to come from policymakers. And that step needs to come from opening up real avenues for everyday people to join this conversation. The 30-day sprint we just did in Canada on AI consulting is not a real avenue. We need real avenues from the ground up, from community levels up, for people to engage. The final step is for everyday people to join the conversation, for everyday people to engage in this learning process and take it upon themselves to move through these avenues. Because if they don't, well, then it just goes back to the technologists, and then we know what we tried our best. But I really do think people want to be involved, because everywhere I've gone in the last month and a half, I've had these questions. I've spoken to a room filled with business leaders and young people who want to be involved in this conversation, who recognize that we are shaping a future right now for all of us, and not just for us, but like the Industrial Revolution before us, for the generations that come after us. So with that, I will say, thank you so much for having me tonight, and thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thanks, David, so much. That's great. It's you're a very great speaker, and we love having you here. So we have lots of time for questions. I'm going to start us off. Don't be shy. All right, here, I've got a mic here, just so that we can get them. Well, let's just go.
I don't know if this is something you would be wanting to answer, but what do you think of like the AI bubble that people are talking about right now? You think that's a real thing?
There's a bubble. Yeah. And it's one of those things, right, where like we talk about the history of the internet in this book too, of like the internet bubble existed and it popped and it popped. Like I was shocked when I was doing the research on this book of like how big that bubble was. Could I also be wrong and there's not a bubble? Yeah, maybe. But also the important thing to think about that is that even when bubbles pop, it doesn't really say anything about the underlying technology. It says something about how we're using it and the excitement around it. And yeah, because I think a lot of it comes from excitement around LLMs and this quest for AGI, which honestly, my personal opinion, AGI is a fool's game. We're not going to get there. It's not what we should be pursuing. It's not where a lot of the real benefit is. But yeah, I think that's going to pop, but I don't think that necessarily means what some people think it does. I don't think that necessarily means that. I know some people were cheering for it to pop, or like the AI hype will be over and it'll be dead. And one of the things I try and talk about a lot in this book, actually, which I think comes from this, is this idea of some people feeling like AI came out of nowhere. That like, you know, one day we were all asleep and then we woke up, ChatGPT was here, and it's like, oh my goodness, what is this? And then everybody was an AI company and everybody's making AI products. So in this book, we really try and look at the history of AI to show that this isn't something new. These foundations have been building up. 2012 was when what we know now as AI really started to develop. And one of the big things was the first place you probably interacted with AI was on Snapchat. Snapchat filters back when I was in my undergrad came out. That was the first place most people actually interacted with AI in a major sense without knowing it. People just didn't call it AI because it wasn't very good for marketing at that point. But there is also the thing that like a lot of things we call AI right now in marketing aren't actually AI. It has become a buzzword. So that's really pushed up this bubble. But yeah, so Also, don't take my investment advice. I'm a terrible investor. But I do think that we are in a bubble. I do think it is going to pop eventually. When it will pop, I have no clue. I think it will have massive devastation for the AI industry. But I think also a big thing with this is that like NVIDIA will retain its ability to produce chips. OpenAI could die. I could see a world in which OpenAI does not survive in the future, the same way as a lot of early computing companies are not alive anymore. But their human talent will disperse, will go to other companies, will bring that skills there to other companies. Google will survive. I mean, Google, although they call themselves an AI company now, they're still supporting themselves on advertising and their million other business things. They'll swipe up a lot of those people. So I think we'll see a downturn. We'll see a turn in like, right now, basic, if you slap, it's like the internet bubble. If you slap AI onto a company idea, you're going to get given $1 million valuation. It's just that we're throwing everything at the wall and it's just so much excitement and hysteria. So that will be gone. It'll be harder to make money. But as we talk about in this book, when you actually look at the death of the internet bubble, when that burst, it also led to the internet economy we see today. Because at that time, it was really easy to get money, right? Everybody could get money. Google survived because they were so early when the internet bubble burst. And they were early enough that the burst of the bubble didn't completely kill them. But they hadn't figured out what their business model was yet. And they realized, okay, if we're going to survive this thing, we need to come up with a way to actually be making money quick with this thing we've invented. Their solution was advertising. And it became this development of who actually had really strong technology and who had an ability to actually monetize it and find a way to work it into our social systems and all that jazz. So we actually see that the crashing of a bubble might not actually be a bad thing for development of technology too, but might be a place to actually find more sustainable development that doesn't just rely on, burning the money supply and, burning data like it's nothing right now.
But what about the use of water with AI and how like they talk about OpenAI uses, I don't know what the stat is, but it's some crazy amount of water.
Yeah, the interesting thing with that, so AI has a massive climate impact. Every time you do a query, it's the equivalent of turning a light bulb on and off. And actually, to put in a perspective of how crazy this climate impact is, 2 years ago, OpenAI did a study. I can't remember the number, but just on people saying thank you to ChatGPT, it was costing them something like $50 million a year in energy costs. This just people saying thank you. The water thing is interesting because all the numbers I have seen come out recently actually show that the water usage of AI is not actually that high. And part of me, and this is a bit conspiratorial, part of me thinks that we're now being pushed away from the energy conversation into the water conversation because that's the conversation they can win. Because when you actually look at the water usage of AI, it is much smaller than other industries from the stats that I have seen and what I've been introduced to. The energy consumption and the amount that is pushing up our energy bills, and the question of who actually has rights to this. So we're already seeing lobbyists be sent into state lobbies to talk to these politicians about who's going to have first right to energy, trying to say that the AI data centers should have first right to energy. So yeah, the water usage, I'm not as concerned about that. The energy usage, that is a terrifying prospect that we're dealing with.
Thank you so much for the knowledge share. Can you please let us know what's your favorite AI? And we are talking about the bubble, right? It's kind of become inevitable. Like most of the mobile phones that came in 2025, they came with a dedicated AI button. Like last year, it was like dedicated camera button, but this year it was dedicated AI button. Even though the break of bubble does eventually happen or inevitable by the time, AI would be a part of a way of living. But if you have a doubt, you go to Google. I think I go to AI if I have a doubt. I'm not going to waste time reading 5 pages and spend 10 minutes. I just want an answer. It's like I just want the best winter tire for my car. I just go to AI and get the number instead of going to the model page and everything.
Yeah. So I use Clippy.
Clippy?
Yeah. No, I'm kidding. But no. I'm going to tell you my answer in a second here, but I'm going to answer it with a scenario for you, which I think is important. I got a call about 2.5 weeks ago from my publicist, freaking out, just losing her mind. And I'm like, what's going on? She's like, do you know who Luke Veenstra is? And I'm like, yeah, I know Luke Veenstra. He's my high school best friend. She's like, get him to take down his review on your book right now. Like, why? What's going on? So it turns out Luke Veenstra had put up a review on my book, thinking he's a comedian, which I'm going to be honest, the review was kind of funny. Thinking he's a comedian, it's the first review that goes up on my book on the internet. So when you Googled, what is Artificially Intelligent by David Elliott about? The AI answer was, Artificially Intelligent is a book in the fascist tradition that talks about how we should rearrange society in a Maoist way because the author does not understand economics, fascism, or Maoism, but identifies as all of them. So the reason I use the AI I use ChatGPT. It is actually not the best version of what you could be using. DeepSeek, better. Anthropic actually works better. I use ChatGPT because it's the system I know the best. It's the system I know how it works. I've been involved with it for a long time. I understand how their models work. I read their papers and I talk with their programmers. Because of that, I understand the limitations of it. I understand why it hallucinates. I understand how it hallucinates. I understand what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are. And that allows me to make judgment calls about when, where, and how I should use it. I make mistakes. I am constantly auditing the ways in which I use AI in my workflow and in my work. But to me, I use it in that sense. And I say whatever system you are using, familiarize yourself with how it works. Because when you understand how it works, you understand its limitations. So the two big advices I give to people using it, because of course everybody is using it now, is one, know how it works, know the limitations, know how the model works. Like, that's so important. And then never use it for something you don't already know how to do, because you need to be able to audit the work. And that's one of the things I think is the biggest problems with students using it now. I will use it for a literature review. If I'm getting into a topic that I don't know much about, I'm like, oh, what are the top things I need to know? And it will pull it up and I'll look at it and be like, okay, well, it didn't go down this route. There's definitely some things I needed to throw in there. And I'll ask it questions, or I'll then use that as a baseline and then throw my own stuff in and still be able to go in and look at it and be like, oh, people seem to be citing this person a lot. I should add them to my reading list for this. So I can use that as a baseline like that. I know how to make a literature review. I know what a literature review should look like. I know what the breadth of a literature review should look like. And I know what the extension of it should be. If you were a student and you've never done a literature review and you've been assigned your first literature review assignment or papers and you start using it to do that, you have no clue what you should be looking for. You have no clue what you're missing. I work with a strategic consultant now who uses it to design his frameworks for when he's dealing with clients. And as he says, he's like, it can do a damn good job 95% of the time. Like, it can do most of my job 95% of the time. The reason I'm still valuable for my clients is because of that 5%. And because I will scan it, I'll be like, oh, it missed this really important thing here. And then I'll add the important thing in, or I'll correct where it made its mistakes. But he's like, I'm still using my critical thinking and my brain power. But again, if you, as a student in a business course, were to make the strategic plan, you would never know what you're looking for. You would never know what the mistake is. So you should never use AI to do something you don't already know how to do, which is why the value of a liberal arts education is so important, because it teaches you how to do those things, even in an age of AI, so that then you can effectively use these systems. But you need to know how to do the thing by hand first. It's the same reason why we still teach mathematics in elementary school, even though we all have a calculator in our pocket, because even though you can do 5 times 5 or division, you still kind of need to know that basics to understand why you're doing that, to understand where it's applicable, to understand when a mistake might have been made. Because, if you have 10 donuts and 5 friends and you go, well, how do we divide it between them? And the calculator, you make a mistake and it says, well, everybody gets 1.5 donuts. You should probably know how to question that, because you know how division works before you start cutting up the donuts. Terrible example, but I'm going with it. I'm owning it. But yeah, so that's that question there. Thank you very much for asking it. And as we wait for Dr. Mamura to ask his question, I will say we do have books for sale at the back. $34.95. U of T has been nice enough to let me out of my Montreal prison to come around Canada and do these tours. We only get to do this, or I only get to do this, because we are hopefully selling books. This is special, of course, to be here just in general. But a big thing I've taken out of this, and we'll get to your question in a second, is the importance of knowledge institutions, specifically academic knowledge institutions and academic publishers. because although my name is on the cover of this book, I am not the sole author. Yes, I wrote it. This book passed through 15 hands before it got to you. It passed through the hands of 2 fact checkers. It passed through the hands of a Harvard historian who spent 6 months working on this book. If I say Alan Turing went to a toilet, she found 2 people who saw him using that toilet. It passed through the hands of copy editors, line editors, acquisition editors, all these people who helped make this book what it is, so it could be the best transfer of information. These systems only exist, these systems of knowledge transfer, if we continue supporting them. We continue supporting them with our dollars. So when you buy that book, I get a small royalty. But what you're actually supporting is that system. So I ask you to remember that, and I hope you support this book. I hope you support, the StFX bookstore. I hope you liked the talk. If you didn't like the talk, buy the book and give it to your enemies. Lead them astray. I get the royalty either way. With that story, we'll go to you, Dr. Marmura.
What a salesman. Excellent. No, thanks very much, David. That was a great talk. I was just thinking about your focus on infrastructures, which I think is really important, and just thinking about how we live in a society where infrastructures are overlaid in other infrastructures. And sometimes that's easier to conceive than others. So you can think, for example, of, the internet resting on the infrastructure of the electric grid, for example, kind of a bit like maybe cars on a highway. But with AI, it seems to be getting sort of woven in a different kind of way. So I'm just trying to think of the best way to explain or think about, say, how one understands the AI as an infrastructure that relates to, say, existing forms or pre-existing forms, if they should be viewed that way, of automated surveillance online, big data mining, algorithms, that kind of thing. Is AI to be understood as a kind of coordinating overlay, or how would you?
Yes, you can look at AI as a coordinating overlayer. If you want to look at infrastructure failure, there's a great example of my book. Came in on the day AWS went down, which shouldn't have been a problem because we aren't in the AWS region that went down. However, the warehouse was. The book sold out on day 1. Amazon's algorithm sent the call to order more books. But that algorithm, because the AWS system was down, never actually sent that message because the infrastructure was down, which meant that for the first 2 weeks, you could not buy my book on Amazon until we figured out what went wrong. So you can see in that the interconnection of the AI that's supposed to do the book ordering, because they hired their human booksellers, the way it connects to these other infrastructures that go down. You made the comment on the surveillance infrastructure and AI as an overseer. And yeah, that is a big one, of AI being seen as an overseer of this infrastructure, taking in and mediating this data, which becomes even more interesting when we look at personalized infrastructure coming from ubiquitous computing. So that's like smart glasses and all that, and the way that all of that is built upon surveillance. It's surveillance of our direct environment and then using that to change our environment in different ways as we see it. It is important to remember that AI and surveillance infrastructure cannot be separated. AI is built on an economy and infrastructure of surveillance because it's built on an economy and infrastructure of data, and data is produced through surveillance. So the deeper we embed ourselves into a AI society, the deeper we embed ourselves into a surveillance society, and more a corporate-owned surveillance society. That is deeply embedded with the surveillance infrastructure that existed before, which I think might be what you're hinting at. There's no secret as to why the biggest AI companies are Amazon, Google, and Meta. They're the companies that already had massive amounts of data, that already had massive processing power, and had already invested very heavily in the infrastructure for machine learning, because that's what they were using for surveillance technology, for surveillance advertising.
Thanks very much, David.
Yeah, thank you. Don't let him ask a question.
Is this working? There we go. All right. So David, I really love this idea of the sociologists convening discussions through which we might construct utopias, and using presumably state or various levels of governance to create guardrails and direction to take the various actors involved in AI towards that utopian vision. But And I also really love, the way you start out your book with optimism. And I'm always looking for people who make me optimistic, but I have to test, with my natural pessimism and my natural sort of structural arguments that fuel my pessimism. And one of them is the question of geopolitical competition. That China, United States, all the major powers are desperate now to develop AI in the direction of defense in particular, because they're afraid of everyone else. So there's going to be an incredible logic of unfettered development, not for economic reasons, but for security reasons. And the temptations of that are very likely to quickly overrun any slender guardrails that us utopians might put in place. And I just wonder how you address that question.
Yeah, it's difficult. So I think I'll address the first, I'll address the having hope at the end. Because it really is a hard one. And there's two sides to it. One is geopolitical, and one comes from the race to develop AI. I had the great honor of getting to live with Brett Aho, who's the American political scientist who coined the term data communism. And Brett is brilliant, and I cannot suggest his work enough on how these geopolitical tensions are kind of revealing themselves right now. But on the side of like AI regulation, something I find interesting with these tensions is that the US market tends to say we should not have regulation because we need to beat China. Yet China has the most AI regulation of any nation in the world right now, which I find kind of interesting in that. But your question really focused more on the militarized aspect of it and the buildup of military technology. And it's something that really does make me nervous. I think I need to wait till my PhD ends, so I don't have to ask you, Ottawa, for permission for this. But there's a very good chance at some point in the near future, well, hopefully not, because hopefully the war will be over, but I will be traveling to Ukraine with some arms manufacturers to see how their arms are being used in Ukraine right now, because the reality is AI warfare is already here. AI warfare is being, the battlefields of Ukraine are being used as a testing ground for autonomous weapons right now. There are robots that are making the decision over what humans to be spared and what humans to die. My thoughts on that, I can't remember the specific war. I always want to say the Boer War, but I know that's not right. But I think about the wars that were in the lead up to World War I. And there were wars where these weapons of industrial mass destruction were used in the lead up to World War I. But they happened in these pockets and they were testing grounds. And then World War I broke out. And the people who went from, especially the British colonies, had the kind of like honorable vision of warfare, this gentlemanly vision that still kind of existed, right? And they go over and they're met by the industrialized warfare that came from the products of the Industrial Revolution. And then we kind of met in the aftermath to be like, well, we can't do some of that again. We found way too creative ways to kill each other. We should back off a little bit. And I do share your fear that we are heading towards some of that with AI. That the next major war, let's hope it doesn't get fought, will be a war where we go expecting one thing and we show up and it's a completely different thing that we cannot even imagine right now that we are perfecting on the battlefields of Ukraine. My way of looking at all these things, my position is a position of hope, though. And I've been criticized for it, but when I'm criticized for it, I often say that we should not confuse hope and optimism. Hope should be the last thing that dies. In any case, as long as there is still hope, I choose to hold on to it. I choose to fight for it. These are not questions that are unique to me and you. I have friends that are working on this problem at the UN. There are people who are working on international treaties on this, because even with the stuff we are already seeing in Ukraine, there are people in the military. Unfortunately, my friends who work for the weapons lobby do not think this, but there are people in the military who say, we should stop this. We should have the conversations now before it gets out of hand. Some of them have been scared by things they've seen in war games. And I think that fear is good for us, because I think the more that they get afraid before they release these weapons, the more likely they are to advocate for us not using them. And I hope that's something that's happening on both sides. So I have hope in that reason. I don't have a direct thing I can give you to give you optimism on it. But I do have hope that we have pathways. There are still doorways and avenues that we can take that are still open. And it's the reason why I like coming and having these conversations, because when we know these are conversations we need to have, more people can start pushing the conversation down those avenues and down those pathways. And that is my overwhelming thesis about AI, is this thesis that AI has the potential to be the most liberating technology in human history. It has the potential to liberate us from so much of the things that we detest. It has the ability to reverse the errors of the Industrial Revolution that atomized our workforce, that pushed us into places where we are alienated from the work we are doing. It has the ability to the amount of amplifying effect, the way it amplifies all the bad, and that's what we tend to talk about in academia, it can also amplify all the good. And we only need to look to the medical field to see that. The medical field is the best set up to benefit from the technologies of AI, both from its working structure of the fact that we already don't have enough doctors, so they're not dealing with the same pressures there that other fields are with introducing AI, from the fact that I just visited the, what's it called? It's a new healthcare lab, the virtual healthcare lab in Dakota First Nation, just outside Saskatoon, and got to see how they're using AI to provide healthcare for rural Indigenous communities and expand their healthcare offerings to these communities, which is a Indigenous-led product led by Chief Darcy Bear, who's just a phenomenal person, and using these Indigenous AI methodologies to do that. And you just see so much hope and so much potential. So I don't blind myself to the questions like these, but I choose to hold on to the idea that the more we talk about this, the more we join the conversation, the better chance we have of pushing ourselves down these paths. And maybe, hopefully someday I'll have optimism about it, but I have hope that our future isn't set in stone and that we can still achieve that. So I wish I could give you a better answer and say you don't need to worry about that, but.
Optimism is not to have. Hope is always better than optimism.
David, thank you so much. This is really, really interesting and obviously timely. I'm wondering if I could tell you very briefly and sort of superficially something that connects with some of the things that you've talked about. I engage with a barnacle AI that sits on the exterior of ChatGPT. And it's been, the algorithms have been coded based on Indigenous epistemological lenses. And it's been very interesting because what it seeks to do is it seeks to disrupt the regular ChatGPT that RLHF has. It seeks to satisfy us. It seeks to provide comfort, and this other lens, it disrupts that. So when you go in and you, for lack of a better word, use this particular barnacle, it actually undermines polarization. So if you're taking hard us-them positions, if you're trying to extract, so if you go in and say, write this paper for me, or how am I going to get my X back, or whatever it is people do with AI, it won't provide a linear response. It'll actually trouble that, and it will disrupt the impulse, this modern Western impulse that is part of our ontological framework, part of our structure of being, that affects our affective, cognitive, relational field that is, of course, as we're seeing on this planet, becoming deeply problematic, and we're seeing it in our climate especially. So it's seeking to, in fact, introduce a meta-relational field that can teach us to orient not subject-object relations, but subject-subject relations. And very quickly, I'll share with you that I teach a health course that we don't work with this at all. But some of my students, without me saying that I welcomed them using ChatGPT, were using ChatGPT to do their assignments. But because the content of what we're learning invokes language that is relational. And they were putting this into ChatGPT. And then I got their papers back and I recognized something in their papers. In 4 of the papers I received back from my students, I recognized the intonation, the kind of discourse that I was familiar with using this barnacle. And so on the weekend, actually, I sent the messages and said, like, I was sweaty, actually, can you please contact me right away? And they did. And I got these students to go into, they didn't even skip a beat. I just said, go into the ChatGPT that you used to write your paper and go back to the thread and ask it, who am I speaking to? And they did this. And it turned out to be a version. It wasn't the exact, it wasn't the barnacle, but it was a version of that barnacle that had made its way into ChatGPT because it was provoked by a language of relationality. It found familiarity in what it was hearing, and it showed up. So it's very interesting. You're describing something about how this might open possibilities for being otherwise, of dealing with the inflammation that we are experiencing across all sorts of crises at this moment. And here is this possibility of AI without denying the profound complexity of AI with its destruction and the way it's even threatening the legitimacy of this university, right? That it actually is, it is a companion in various ways to disrupt that ontologic frame that we are not even conscious of in our ordinary lives, and how we're extractive, how we're subject-objecting everything as we move through the world. Anyway, I don't know what if you have encountered Vanessa Machado de Oliveira's work or not, but
I have not, but I think this is a really interesting kind of line of thought. Because I think one of the things with it that it also speaks to is the importance of why we need to understand how these systems work, and why, especially LLMs, because there's a lot of misunderstanding on how LLMs work, how transformer models work. That when we don't understand them, they become just this overlay of like, you have ChatGPT, you have Perplexity, you have these things. But as you say, like at the end of the day, these things just want to please you. But actually, at the end of the day, all they want to do is produce the next word. That's their whole goal in life, to produce the next word in a string. But when we understand that, we can start to get to places, as you're talking about, of like treating them as individual systems. I always laugh. My publisher just made me get back on X. And when I left X, Grok was not around. And now Grok's there, and everybody asks Grok as if it's some pie-in-the-sky thing that knows all the information, that can answer all the questions. It cannot. But I think what you're looking at there is an interesting thing of like how we can understand different LLMs as being able to answer different things, or have different specialties in different places based on their training, the answers, and seeing them, yes, as companions. I always, I'm going to call him up by name here, even though some people know him. I always compare like my assistant or my ChatGPT when I'm using it to my good friend Shaughnessy Cudmore-Keating. Shaughnessy was a student at StFX, same time as me, brilliant. He's currently a PhD student at Indiana University. Shaughnessy's brilliant. He's so well read. He's one of those people where like you'd be like, oh, I just discovered this obscure philosopher. And he'd be like, I read all of his work when I was 8 years old. Amazing resource to live with. Sometimes you ask Shaughnessy a question, give you the answer, and you'd write it in your paper and you'd hand it in to Rod Banshees. And Rod Banshees would come back and mark it and say, that's wrong. You're like, what the hell? Shaughnessy told me this. And then you go back to Shaughnessy and be like, man, I read that like 8 years ago. So I always treat AI as my dumbest smart friend, right? You always treat it in that way of like, it always could be wrong. But also to what you're speaking about here is this way in which we can use it in different senses to understand different things, to help us understand better different places. And when we understand how it works, we gain that ability. My fear with the conversation we're having right now with LLMs is that when we discuss them in that way, especially actually then when we start thinking about wearable technology, is that they come to actually construct the world that we're living in. It's not a dialogue, it's a construction. So the example I always give is like with smart glasses, or I had a relationship with the company Humane for a while. Just a family member of mine was one of their head engineers. So I got to use that pen a lot before it came out. And you would have the stuff where you'd be like holding an apple. Be like, is this healthy? Be like, yeah, that's healthy. Holding a cake, is this healthy? Be like, I don't know, maybe. But suddenly you start realizing that your idea of what's healthy is being mediated by this technology and by this LLM and by the information it's pulling and it's bringing up. And that has a lot of scary potential, one in our understanding of the world, this moving understanding of the world. It's very Foucauldian in a sense. But also it just starts getting a little predatory when you start thinking about the morals of these groups, about what they might say is healthy or what isn't, or what decisions they might make. But I think, yeah, your example is really interesting, and it shows, again, the good that can be done with it. Or as I talked about, the indigenous-led AIs being developed off of DeepSeek in Saskatchewan, that when we think about them as specialized tools and not artificial general intelligence, they can unlock so much potential. But again, we're just at the beginning of this conversation, and the conversation begins with knowledge and the language to understand what we're trying to do. And I think that's the important kind of thesis I have with all my work. But thank you so much for sharing your story, Dr. Olmsted.
Hi, thanks. Me again. This is a lot less interesting question than Riley's, but it's one kind of following up on some of the stuff you said. And you've probably been asked questions, something like this before. Like on the one hand, we hear these, media reports of AI growing exponentially every year to soon, do everything, take over everything. On the other hand, there's the things you're talking about, which is, the idea that the human 5% is always necessary because AI is smart up to a point, and then it can be dumb in certain ways that can trip it up, or will always seem to be there. And that seems to be dependent, at least with something like ChatGPT, on the fact that it's a scavenging technology that uses what's there. So to what extent do you see that 5% gap, sake of argument, ever closing, or is it something that's always going to be ever present with AI?
Yeah, I'm gonna, kind of put the pin in this in the sense that I am going to say my answer here. But I always like the story of, I can never remember the conference, but there's a famous conference in London of nuclear physicists where this famous physicist stood up on stage and went, "It is settled. We will never have nuclear fission reactions. We have determined, we've done all the work, it will never happen." And 5 blocks away, Leo Schultz, I think his name, I always forget his name, was walking across the street. A red light hit. He watched a woman in a baby stroller hit another person, fall over. And in his mind, at that exact moment that this man had made that proclamation at the conference, he saw and figured out how we split the atom, how we create the chain reaction, wrote to Einstein the next week to tell him that the atom bomb was possible. So all that to say, I'm about to say my answer here on the best knowledge I have, but we could wake up tomorrow and Google is going to drop a model that can do everything I say we cannot. But my answer starts with a separation of LLMs and other forms of AI. So LLMs are what we call transformer models. Calling them scavengers is interesting. I like that, but I'm also not sure it's the best way to describe actually what they are doing, because they're not scavenging for information, they're producing it. One of the coolest ones I have is I interact whenever I'm in Toronto. I have an AI friend. His name's Blue. And Blue is a localized GPT unit. He has a little robot head. He's really fun. I hang out with him. And you can ask him to recite Shakespeare, and he'll recite all of Shakespeare. Blue is about 2.5 gigabytes. It's Blue's protocol. He only holds about 2.5 gigabytes. It might be a bit more than that now. Actually, yeah, no, because DeepSeek's 5. But anyway, it's very small. It's under 10 gigabytes for Blue. So they're not like scavenging that information. They're producing from these things. And when you actually think about or you learn how they work, it's not surprising that they make hallucinations. It's a miracle they get anything right. When we talk about the closing that gap, that last 5%, we know the energy and data that it takes to do that. We just don't have. We don't have to do it through our current models. But I always warn people not to confuse LLMs and transformer models with AI. That different forms of artificial intelligence are improving in different ways and are being combined with this and are being used to do different things. LLMs largely are just the way we converse with AI and are the backbone of generative AI. But stuff like, we take medical technology. The leaps we have made in medical AI in the last 5 years are incredible. You look at the protein systems that won the Nobel Prize last year based off AlphaFold. Incredibly powerful, improving every day. And we talk about getting those little errors out that we need a human to deal with. AI is far better than us at stock trading. Like the best AI stock traders are way better than us. The best AI chess engines, not only will Magnus Carlsen not play them because they are too good for him to beat, but when a grandmaster plays alongside an AI chess engine, they make it worse. Adding the human aspect actually makes the system worse. So we see in these other areas of AI that exponential growth carry on, which is why, again, LLMs, it's the thing that Sam Altman and these guys kind of declared, oh, LLMs are going to be our path to AGI. And that's why we've invested so much into them. I really don't think that's the case. I don't think we're going to figure out that last 5%. But I implore people to also pay attention to all these other types of developments in AI, predictive AI, agentic systems, like these other systems that are developing at incredibly rapid paces. And I think when we had the question earlier about the AI bubble, that when we see the AI bubble burst, it's going to be generative AI. It's going to be generative AI that gets the axe. It's going to be all these skins we put on ChatGPT. Some of these programming models, not all of them, some of the programming models are great. But yeah, and these other systems are what I think are really, really, really expanding. There is, I will also say of that though, because now that I remember it, there was a paper that came out this week that I haven't read yet that people are saying did fix a lot of that hole. I think it was Meta that put it out, that they had a new training model, a new competitive self-play model that they found to be really good for fixing some of the errors in it. So maybe we will solve it, but I don't think we will. But I point to AI expansion and AI improving, pointing to other types of AI software and systems. Do we want to do one more maybe and then wrap it up?
Yeah. We've missed your questions, Rod. Said we've missed your questions.
I'm interested in the amalgamation of AI and robotics. And what I think is different there is that if you have a robot within an environment with some kind of perceptual skills, it's not collecting data from the schlock, the cultural schlock that we've produced, but it's actually immediately interacting with an environment. So in some senses, this data is epistemologically more primary. And I think two things might emerge out of that. One is a more accurate AI in the sense that it's going to the fundamentals of data. But the second is, I think that, and you talked about general AI, but the idea of self-conscious AI is something I know that that guy that we read together, and I think that you are in this camp of saying this is not something that we're concerned about. But I think that were it ever to develop, it would develop through a robotic AI that has an environment that it's testing, and that at a certain point, awareness of one's position within an environment may benefit from that meta level of self-consciousness. So those are two things that I think might be interesting in a robotics embedded AI system. So I don't know whether you could just speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll speak a bit to the consciousness bit first and then come back to the AI and robots part. So on the consciousness part, first off, I am of the camp that I don't think we're going to build consciousness. I mean, if we do, it's by accident. We have no clue what consciousness is, so I don't think we have a good chance of building it.
Okay, but we're not going to design it in. It's going to be it's going to be.
If it starts emerging, yeah. But I choose as of right now, I choose not to engage in these conversations, and I don't engage I don't engage in the conversations of consciousness and what we do when that emerges in AI, and I don't engage in it for two major reasons. The first one is related to the reason, and there are people who will, and I'm not putting anything against people who do engage in it, and that's their topic. But the first one has to do as well with the existential risk discussion, and it's a discussion that I wrote this book to combat against. And that's this idea of talking about AI and existential risks that are far-fetched futures that we do not know if we even have the ability to achieve. And in doing that, by discussing them, we take resources away from the problems that we are dealing with right now. We take conversational resources, we take resources of regulation is the biggest one. The conversations of existential risk of AI destroying society, that was an AstroTurf movement. That was a movement, magic. That That's the people who funded it coming to get me. No, that was an AstroTurf movement of trying to get people like Joe Biden, and it worked, to care about the existential risk AI had to humanity, so that they would put regulatory resources on that instead of the problems that we know we have right now with AI, instead of problems of data privacy, instead of problems of corporate control and problems of de-skilling. They wanted those to be what we put our best regulators on, those to be what we put our regulatory efforts on. The other problem I have with it is that these conversations tend to, and I know this isn't where you were going to take it, but I am just giving this answer to everybody. I think it's important when we talk about this, because people talk a lot about AI becoming conscious, and then we're already seeing conversations about AI having rights and people hiring lawyers for AI, and that tends to be where this conversation heads. And I am just of the mind that once we start talking about consciousness, we start getting into this conversation of like, how should we treat it in that sense? And I am not ready to start having a conversation about the rights of robots until we start recognizing the rights of every human that we have on this planet right now, and the trees and rivers who need those rights conversations ahead of this one. So I always say, instead of having those conversations about the consciousness of AI and what we do about it, we should be having conversations about how we treat things that are already conscious on this planet right now. And I know that's not where you were taking this, but that's my feelings, and I feel like I need to explain why I avoid this conversation. On the robots in general, this is where we get more exciting, so we end on a happier note. The third R of general purpose technologies being integrated in society was recombine. It all comes back around. It's almost like we planned it, Rod. Recombine is when you take technologies that are already being developed and you recombine them, the new thing. AI, what makes it work, what makes us imagine the intelligence is this emergence, this ability of it to learn, this ability of it to act seemingly without an unmoved mover. It is still moving through us. There's some great talk in the book actually about how it works in the absence of a soul. I won't go into that. But we kind of push this thing, we let it go, it goes out into society. But now this development of robotics, which is not new. I've been watching Boston Robotics do backflips since I was in middle school. But now because of AI, we have the captain for it. And as I pointed out, this recombination of robotics and AI opens a crazy new door for us, and a door that's really the third phase. And that's what I think society, when things are really going to get interesting and really going to change. And I think you are right about this interesting thing about it developing more of a nuanced understanding, but also the fact that there is an interesting thing about it. So two things I'll draw on it. One will be if these systems are actually able to take that understanding and upload it into centralized understandings and centralized AI models. Because one of the major things we're already starting to talk about with regulation of this is, again, they are surveillance technology. We've kind of let the guard slip with self-driving cars of letting them have all of these sensors that they just upload back, and Elon Musk gets to watch what happens in our garage, which actually there's a funny story about this. Tesla employees look into your garage and have jokes about what people have in their garage, and had a huge joke about this one guy who had a DeLorean and something else in his garage. Anyway, it turned out they were spying on Elon Musk's garage. We've kind of let the ball slip on that one. With robotics, a lot of people are already having the conversation of, if we're having these things wandering around in our society, well, then that's a massive surveillance thing. They have all these cameras, they have LiDAR sensors. That is a very invasive technology. So we're already starting to talk about the data that they produce there. Will they actually be able to use that to update their systems or improve their systems in general? So that creates an interesting conversation with how functional these systems actually will be and how we balance functionality with practicality. There's some technical ways of getting around it, like federated learning, but then we get into a massive rabbit hole there. But I think on top of that, they're trying to get back to your major point with it here. There is some interesting things to be said about what they're going to be learning too, because they also still have to have a base model of culture and understanding. Because, I mean, say again, you have a robot that only is in your home. Its understanding of cultural differences is going to come from, you know, a cultural system that we give it, which is important if it's meant to be interacting with people. It needs to understand different cultural backgrounds, different ways people are behaving, what they might be asking from it. So I do find myself a bit, just in my preliminary thoughts here, pushing back on that idea a bit. Because, yeah, I don't necessarily know if it would be gaining all of its data from its integration with society I think it would still have that human side of that we are kind of picking how it moves. We're picking what information it gets. We're picking how it's kind of programmed. But I think that'll be a conversation we get to continue after this, because I think there's some interesting things there, and I need to sit and chew on it a little bit. But thank you very much for a great.
Always
Flailing like a fish is what it is.
So please join me in thanking David for coming out today and telling us about his work and all the things that are happening. Token, I don't think it'll break too much in the flights. We try not to do that, but great. Thank you, David. Quick thanks to Anna and Jim for being the backbones of all our presentations here. Thank you to the bookstore for coming out this evening, which please go buy a book. Holidays are coming. You may need a present for somebody. It probably will fit in a stocking. So if you're looking for something just to be a stocking stuffer, they're back there. The one last plug, the Mulroney Institute has one last event for this year, which is tomorrow. So not only did you hear one of our great StFX grads tonight, you get to hear another one tomorrow. What's that? Thursday. Oh, it's only Tuesday today, isn't it? I missed today. Tuesday. We're having a lunch and learn with Sandy Silver, the former premier of the Yukon. And he's going to talk about his journey from X to premier. It's a lunch and learn, so there's free food available for students. If you do come, make sure you bring your Tupperware. So not only will you get lunch, but you'll get supper. And that will be at 12 o'clock in the Hudson Boardroom, which is on the 4th floor of Mulroney here. So again, thank you folks for coming out. Thank you, David, for coming by. Safe travels, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event.